This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 215 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest today is Dr. David Tuch. David is a technology entrepreneur and author. His writing uncovers overlooked stories at the intersection of organized crime and espionage. David is originally from New York and has lived in England and France, but now resides in Brookline, Massachusetts with his wife and children. I invited David onto the podcast to discuss his new book, The Wireless Operator, The Untold Story of the British Sailor Who Invented the Modern Drug Trade, which is available now on Amazon. It's about Harold Derber, a merchant sailor and radio operator during World War II, who was later involved in some of the most pivotal events of the early Cold War and became one of the earliest kingpins of international drug trafficking. But first, let me ask you this. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at Krashiki.com. Krust himself scours the world for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at very affordable prices. Find it all at Krashiki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. Or just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. David, thank you for being here.
Justin, it's great to be chatting with you today. Thanks so much for having me. I'm a huge fan of the show.
Oh, wow. Well, I appreciate that. That's always good to hear. I have to tell you, Harold's story is incredible. I learned it all directly from your book, of course, and I'm actually very surprised that his name wasn't already familiar to me because I cover and read so much of this era of history, and his life touched on so many of the events that I've talked about in the past here. So this was a real breath of fresh air to me and something that I should have probably known about by now, but did not until I read your book.
You're not alone. It's really shocking that his story is not more widely known, considering he played such a pivotal role in so many aspects of the drug trade and the Cold War. I feel really fortunate that we stumbled on his story and are now able to bring it to a wider audience.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I was very happy to get the opportunity to read this early on. And I understand also that you have a very, very direct personal connection to his story as well.
Yeah, that's right. So Harold Derber is actually my cousin. I stumbled on his story while I was doing some genealogy research and I was trading notes with a distant cousin. And he said almost matter of factly, oh, you should look into our mutual cousin, this fellow named Harold Derber. He was a major gun runner and drug smuggler, gunned down in Miami. And it was one of those invitations that was really hard to turn away from. I followed up with one of my other relatives who said, equally matter of fact, oh yeah, he used to run drugs for Castro. And so with that kind of introduction, it was really hard to turn away.
I'll bet. So did you ever meet him as a baby or anything like that? Or was he already passed away before,
So he was assassinated in the mid 1970s. So I was just a small child at the time. I never had the chance to meet him.
Okay, I see. Yeah, well, now you've shared his story with so many more people. I'm sure it feels like you know him pretty well at this point.
Yeah, it's amazing. So, the more I dig, the more questions also surface. So I feel like I've been able to uncover a lot of his life, but there are still a lot of fascinating aspects that I think remain to be uncovered.
Yeah, I can imagine. You've published the book already. Did you find it difficult to research even with these unanswered questions? I mean, was a lot of this still truly hidden away until you found it?
It's a great question. I think there are some aspects that made it very straightforward and some aspects that made it incredibly difficult. On the helpful side, I was fortunate that he had left an imprint in multiple national archives. So he's described in the Swiss National Archives, the Colombian Archives, the British Archives, the JFK Library, the LBJ Archives, and so on. So he's left a very large footprint in various government archives. I was also very lucky to have tracked down the memoirs of his lover, who we'll get into in a moment, who has a shadowy past of her own. And I was also able to track down the agents, in particular a few undercover agents that pursued him, as well as his drug trafficking associates. So there well into their 70s and 80s now, but they're very happy to recount their days pioneering the marijuana trade. So, so that
Always
was
helpful.
really,
Yeah.
yeah, that was really remarkable. And I was also helped by a very dedicated team of archival researchers in Tel Aviv, Bogota, England, the UK, the States. So that was extremely helpful. I think some of the more challenging aspects beyond usual challenges writing about espionage were the intersections of espionage and organized crime. So, both parties tend to obfuscate and lie and fabricate. But when you have that intersection, I think it makes it doubly hard. What also made it challenging is that a lot of my relatives are sworn to secrecy. So the ones that had the most direct access to him were forthcoming in some areas, but very tight lipped in others.
Oh
And there's
man.
still some relatives that refused to even mention his name after he was assassinated. Some of the criminal syndicates were actually tracking down some of the family members.
Oh wow.
So that became quite challenging. And then also the Drug Enforcement Administration destroyed all records they had of Harold Derber and his operations. So that made it quite challenging as well.
Hmm.
Some of the agencies were more forthcoming, but the DEA in particular, I think, was very obstructive for some reasons that we'll get into, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. So incredibly intriguing story. Of course, I'm excited to get into it. So I understand that Harold grew up in Manchester in England, but he was not born Harold Darber, right?
That's right. So his birth name was Hyman Tuch His surname Tuch is one of those absurd Germanic names that was given to Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It translates as cloth spoiler. So it was one of those names that precluded a lot of Jews from the trades.
Oh my
So he grew
gosh.
up in a fairly conservative Jewish neighborhood called Cheetham Hill, which was the Jewish quarter in Manchester. And growing up in Manchester during World War II was particularly miserable. So, in addition to the Blitz and the evacuation, which he was subjected to, the British Union of Fascists, the Black Shirts, had their headquarters right outside of the Jewish quarter in Manchester. So, you had to deal with Black Shirts marching through sections of Manchester. And then, one historical fact that I stumbled on that very few people are aware of is that there were Jewish internment camps in England. So roughly 7 to 8,000 Jews were interned at various sites in England because they were technically Austrian or German descendants. So although he was not interned himself, members of his family had to go before the tribunal and defend why they were not enemies of the state. So
Wow.
you had all of these hanging over his head growing up as a young child in Manchester. And you can imagine what an absolutely miserable time that must have been.
I'll bet. I'll bet. And this is with bombs falling and everything, right? Like actually, like post 1939 and wars going
Yeah,
on. So
yeah, that's right. And
tremendous chaos.
Manchester was particularly affected by the Blitz. We tend to focus a lot on London, but because Manchester was a major industrial center and transportation hub, Manchester was also subjected to a number of Blitz raids, which Hyman himself experienced as a young child.
Okay. Okay. I see. Yeah. That quite an upbringing, then a chaotic upbringing, no question. And he joined not the Navy, but the Merchant Navy as a teenager, right? What was it that led him to do that? Considering that, other Jews were being interned, like you mentioned already.
Yeah, so the British Merchant Navy, which is a volunteer civilian force as distinct from the British Royal Navy, which is a military force, allowed members to join at the age of 17, whereas the British Royal Navy required one to be 18. So we can speculate what his specific motivation was, but the fact that it had a earlier age of enlistment was potentially one
Mm.
motivation. He also suffered from tuberculosis as a child, so I don't know if that might have posed any issues for his medical qualification, but he enrolled in wireless college, so that was the schooling required to become a radio operator at 16, and then deployed with the British Merchant Navy at 17. What was very interesting is that he deployed with the Dutch Merchant Navy and then the Norwegian Merchant Navy. So a lot of the countries that had significant merchant fleets but were occupied by the Nazis
Mm.
had a high demand for radio operators. So you can imagine young Hyman Tuchverderber, 17 years old, serving on a Norwegian merchant navy vessel with all these, salty, 2.2 meter tall Norwegian sailors who've been at sea for 10, 20 years. So that must have been quite a shock.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. So, why was he chosen, or did he volunteer to become a wireless operator? Like, that was a pretty, very, like, high tech skill set at the time, right? Was that something he had aptitude for to begin with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do know that he failed his exam the first time around, so
Hmm.
the training was quite rigorous. So normally before wartime, the training program to become certified as a wireless operator was approximately 9 to 12 months. They condensed that down to 3 to 4 months in order to make up for the gap during the war. So he failed his exam the first time. He failed the technical component. I have his exam results, interestingly enough, but qualified the second time around. But he was actually one of the youngest in his class, having started at 16.
Hmm.
So we can give him some license there. I don't have any
Certainly.
specific information about his technical acumen at that stage, but he was obviously extremely clever, and he would later go on to be a mastermind. So, he perhaps had some, proclivity towards some of the more,
Hmm.
technical aspects of being a radio operator. It was also a common calling for a lot of Jews for some reason. So there was a disproportionate number of Jews who became wireless operators during the war.
Hmm. I had no idea. Interesting. What was it that led him to change his name to Harold Derber anyway? Was that just a choice that he made along the way?
Yeah, so the family as a whole changed the surname from Tuch to Derber in 1944. So he was actually notified while he was at sea. And it was at that time that a lot of Jews were changing their names both to or to anglicize their names and also to better assimilate into society.
Hmm.
So the ancestral last name Tuch is also the origin of my name. So my family, which descended from the German line, took the prefix, which was Tuch or Tuck, and then the British side of the family, which was Derber's side of the family, took the suffix, which
Hmm.
was Derber. So the entire family changed the name from Tuch to Derber, and as part of that, he changed his name from Hyman to Harold. And that was in 1944. And at this point, he was serving in the Battle of the Atlantic as a wireless operator with the Norwegian Merchant Navy. Yeah, what an experience that was as well. And we can get into that, but just the absolute chaos of being in the merchant fleet during the Battle of the Atlantic was just really blows your mind.
Oh, certainly. So I have to admit, I had a little bit of a bias going into not just this episode, but generally, but thinking of, merchant sailors as, unarmed non-combatants, but that's really the furthest from the truth because they were dying in droves throughout the war. Of course, they were like very, very juicy targets for U-boats and that sort of thing, but must have been incredibly perilous.
Yeah, so if there's so many unsung heroes of World War II, but I think the merchant navies definitely rank up there, and the Norwegian merchant navy in particular. So they actually had the highest casualty rate of any service, military or civilian, during the war. So 1 in 6 Norwegian merchant sailors perished
Oh
during the
my
war,
gosh.
and it was for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. They lacked defensive armor. During the early part of the war, they were not sailing in protective convoys; they were sailing as solo ships. And also, it was the deliberate strategy of the U-boats to target the merchant navy vessels in order to starve England and cut off the
Hmm.
food supply lines. And they were very easy targets. And these were civilians. I think what made it also very harrowing, particularly for the Norwegian fleet, is that they were providing the bombs that were used to bomb Norway. So, because Norway was an occupied country, the Brits were, and as well as the Americans, were bombing Norway. So, you can imagine the moral anguish of transporting the weapons being used to
Oh
bomb
yeah.
your own countrymen and family members back in Norway. So, it
Hmm.
was an incredibly, incredibly anguishing experience.
Hmm. Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine. Here's this 16, 17-year-old right in the middle of all that, and I have to imagine. I was even thinking, did he fit in at all on the ship? Like they were all speaking Norwegian around him most of the time on these journeys. I would imagine.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of information about what his particular experience was. I know it could not have been that easy,
Yeah.
given that he was the only non-Norwegian on the ship, let alone being, fairly diminutive and Jewish and having an absurd name. And also, the radio operators were a relatively recent addition to merchant ships. So after the sinking of the Titanic, there was a push to get more radio operators onto ships, but they were employed by a different company than the merchant navy sailors were employed by. So
Hmm.
they were seen as being, so-called company men as opposed to being true sailors. So I think when you put all those factors together, being a young teenager, having an absurd name, being the only non-Norwegian, let alone a Jew, being a radio operator, I can't imagine it was an easy experience.
Oh, right, right. Do you happen to know? Was he ever on a? Did he like survive a sinking, or was he on a ship that was struck or damaged at any point?
It's very interesting. So he claims that he survived 5 torpedo attacks, and I've scoured the records and was able to find a lot of close calls. So they were involved in a number of combat situations, but I could not find any direct record that any of his
Hmm.
ships had been directly torpedoed or sunk. So I don't know if that's a missing piece of the historical record or if he completely confabulated that, which,
Mm.
he's, as we'll find out, he's prone to do from time to time. But in the book, I recount some of the historic battles that he was involved in through the Norwegian fleet.
Okay, yeah, I mean, just incredibly harrowing job, regardless of whether you're actually on a ship that is sunk or not, because that's a possibility at any time. And he served for years. They're not like a 1 year tour, like a modern service members are kind of accustomed to. I think. So he survived the war. Obviously, what was he doing on VE Day when that finally came?
So he had the good fortune of being in New York, actually, for VE Day. So you can imagine the millions of people
Oh gosh.
storming into Times Square to celebrate VE Day. So, and I think he really adopted America as his home country. He had a very strong attachment to the US. And so I think it was, through his time in New York and later in Miami that he developed a very strong affection for the US. And, he had the good fortune of being able to celebrate VE Day in what must have been, just, one of the world's greatest parties.
Hmm. Yeah, that must have been an unforgettable experience. So did he stay? Well, was there a merchant marine to stay in even after the war, after the demilitarization and everything? Like, what did
Yeah,
he
so
do in
he
the
actually
aftermath?
served in the British Merchant Navy for 15 years in total,
Oh,
including the 3 years during World War II, and then he stayed with the Merchant Navy until 1958, actually, so relatively late. And I think for him, it provided a world of adventure, of travel. He was able to travel through Africa, Latin America, the Far East, Japan, Hawaii. So by the time he was in his early 20s, he had seen more of the world than most would in several lifetimes.
I'll bet.
And it's very interesting because the British Merchant Navy, as a quasi private fleet, actually was involved in a lot of the clandestine trade in embargoed goods during the Cold War. So he was assigned to a number of ships that were smuggling contraband, for example, contraband oil into the Soviet bloc during the war. So that was some of his first taste of illegal smuggling was through his involvement with the British Merchant Navy after the war.
Okay, I see. And I understand he also had a pretty intriguing role to play during the Israeli War of Independence just a couple of years later, right?
Yeah, that's right. So briefly after the Independence Declaration in May of 48, he traveled to Israel to volunteer as a radio operator and later a boat captain in the Arab-Israeli War. And this is a remarkable piece of history because roughly half of the Israeli Navy was manned by British sailors, both Royal Navy and Merchant Navy sailors. And their objective was to smuggle illegal arms into Israel against the arms blockade that was imposed by the US, UK, and the Arab League. So you had this very incongruous situation where the arms blockade was being manned by British Royal Navy sailors, and then other British sailors, mostly British Merchant Navy sailors, were charged with running that blockade against the Royal Navy sailors that they had been serving shoulder to shoulder with
Hmm.
just a few years ago. And the fact that they were British subjects made it completely illegal. Like most countries, it's illegal to volunteer in a foreign military as a British subject. So their smuggling operation was completely illegal. So most of the weapons for the War of Independence actually came from Stalin through a Nazi surplus cache that he seized in Czechoslovakia. So there's also this wonderfully incongruous aspect that most of the Israeli arms actually were surplus Nazi arms with
Hmm.
Nazi insignia on the Mauser rifles and the like. So there's this wonderful irony of British merchant navy sailors smuggling surplus Nazi weapons through a British blockade to arm the
Yep.
Israelis.
Yep. Whole new paradigm, just after the war ended for so many people, so many reasons, really. It's amazing. Was this
Yeah.
like a one or two fast, smuggler runs that he did, or was this like a long-term operation for him?
So he actually stayed in Israel until after the armistice. So when the Arab Israeli War completed, he stayed in Israel until the early 1950s. I don't have a huge amount of information about what his specific activities were during that time, in part because most of the British volunteers had to sign a secrecy agreement with the Israeli government. From his FBI report, I know that he was attempting to smuggle German arms through Israel to Latin America. So there was an arms export embargo against Germany after the war, but there was a secret arrangement for Germany to provide arms to Israel to help build up the Israeli military after the
Hmm.
war. And one way to provide another market for illicit German exports was to reroute them through Israel. So he was seeking to broker an arms deal to export German weapons through Israel to actually the Dominican Republic in the mid to late
Oh, wow.
1950s. So yeah, so that was very fascinating as well.
Yeah, certainly. I have read a little bit about like the post-war period in World War II and the arms deals and shipments and all that, and I was shocked that the whole continent was just completely awash in arms. Like there would be, a nearly functional tank with machine guns on it, on the side of the road for 2.5 or 3 years after the war ended because there was just so much work to be done. And so, guys would just go over there and they would just like plunder all of these battlefields and that sort of thing, and these warehouses, of course, for arms that spread out throughout the world afterwards. So I guess Harold had a part to play in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating is to reflect on which transportation services were actually redistributing all the war surplus. So the merchant navies actually played a really critical role in, so to speak, rearranging the chessboard
Hmm.
for the Cold War
Hmm.
after World War II. Yeah, and a lot of those arms made their way to Latin America and elsewhere. But it's fascinating to trace how these arms went from Germany through various places to find themselves in the world's next hotspots.
Right. Do you happen to have any information? Like, was his primary contact some government individual in Dominican Republic, for example, or was he selling to an arms dealer, like just like a essentially a private or a commercial sale?
Yeah, it's really difficult to know because there was a arms ban against the dictator Trujillo, but the US was still arming the Dominican Republic. I do wonder,
Sounds like us. Okay, yeah.
but he had a $1 million promissory note or a line of credit from the Dominican government, he claimed. And the list of arms that he was seeking reads like what you would need to fund an entire national army. So he was
Mm,
looking to acquire tanks, mortars, bombers. So he was aiming to broker a very large deal.
wow.
What's curious though is, as we'll touch on later in the conversation, is that he became very strongly allied with the Cuban government, which, as we know, was also plotting an invasion of the Dominican Republic.
Right.
So part of me does speculate whether or not he used the DR as a cover when in actuality he was aiming to provide arms to Cuba, which he couldn't say explicitly, in order to support their invasion of the DR.
Hmm.
So unfortunately, I don't have an entirely clear picture on that, but it is fascinating to think, what he could have been doing with that scale of arms that he was looking for.
Absolutely. Yeah, $1 million in the early 1950s would buy a heck
Yep,
of a lot of weaponry, no question.
absolutely.
Wow, and especially when it was dirt cheap then because it was everywhere too, I have to
Yeah,
imagine.
that's also true. That was the time.
So, by this point was smuggling his primary form of income, or was this like a sideline as he continued in the merchant marine or merchant navy?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the British government devalued the pound
Oh,
in
right.
1949. So they depegged the pound from the dollar. And so the value of the pound plummeted by about 40% overnight. And it was a hardship for a lot of the British subjects, but for the merchant navy, it was an absolute disaster because their expenses were in foreign currencies, even though their income was in pounds. And so,
Mm-hmm.
his paycheck was effectively cut by 40% overnight. So he was largely involved in smuggling at this stage, some activities in Israel. And at this point, he starts to establish more of a home base in New York. So even though he's taking repeated assignments with the British Merchant Navy and doing his smuggling runs on the side, he would return to New York more and more as his home base. He had befriended his lifelong friend, a fellow named Ray Adiel, who was a captain in the Israeli army. And the two of them moved to New York, in Morningside Heights on the Upper West Side. And so at this stage, he's scrapping by, surviving with smuggling and arms dealing, and also a small amount of corporate espionage as well. He did launch a mining prospecting operation to British Guiana in the late 1950s as well, with some fellow sailors. And throughout his life, he would claim having diamond and mercury mines in Brazil. So whether or not it's, fanciful or not, it definitely adds to the story.
Wow, certainly. Was it during this time in New York? I believe he had like a brief interaction or almost relationship with Francis Ford Coppola, right? Was that during this time?
It's one of those like colorful facts that just pops up. So he and his friend that I just mentioned, Ray Adiel, produced two films for a young film student at UCLA. It was that student's first two films. And it just so happened that that young film student was Francis Ford Coppola. So Harold Derber and his friend produced Coppola's first two films.
Wow.
One was a voyeuristic softcore porn film, and the other one was a slightly less voyeuristic cowboy nudie film.
Slightly less voyeuristic. Okay, that's good. That's good. Amazing that Coppola got his start, not entirely, of course, he was a very talented guy, but, amazing that Harold was right there at the beginning of such a famous career in Hollywood.
Yeah, it's amazing. Wow. Absolutely.
So, David, you mentioned earlier his partner. I think her name was Sari. Is that right? Can you talk about how they met?
Yeah, that's right. So in the early 1960s, he moves from New York to Miami after he had secured his U.S. visa. And he opens a cruise line to travel between Miami Pier 3 and the Bahamas. And at the time, and still to this day, gambling was legal once you're past the 3-mile limit into international waters. So we established a floating casino on this cruise ship with financial support from the Miami Mafia, the likes of Meyer Lansky, Mike McClaney, Morris Landsberg, and others. And he recruited two women. They were actually identical twins, Sari and Susan Leslie, to serve as entertainment directors on his boat. And they were both absolutely stunning. So redheads, blue eyes, really, really just remarkable. And she was actually a contractor to possibly the CIA or a corporate consortium that was using his cruise ship to smuggle cash and corporate documents out of Havana. So when Derber's ship would land in the Bahamas, she would take a side trip into Havana with bodyguard protection. And this was precisely at the time that Castro was seizing U.S. greenbacks and nationalizing U.S. subsidiaries based in Cuba. And so there was a mad dash to get out cash and corporate documents. And so she was contracted to ferry these documents out of Cuba, using her role as an entertainment director on Derber's boat as his cover. It's unclear, both from her memoirs and also from accounts at the time, whether or not Derber was aware that she was working with the CIA, because, as we'll get into, Derber was closely aligned with Cuban intelligence. So we also have this Mr. and Mrs. Smith situation where she's working with U.S. intelligence, he's working with Cuban intelligence, and they're sort of dancing around each other. But yeah, really remarkable lady. She dropped out of high school, 3 children, divorced her husband, fled Bradenton, which is a suburb outside of Tampa, to go to Miami and then embark on this life of adventure with my cousin.
Wow. Wow, incredible stuff. Were they already in a romantic relationship while this was going on, or did that come later on?
It started pretty quickly. So I think they both had a deep love of adventure. They were both away from home and reinventing themselves. They both had a very passionate calling to the Cuban refugee cause, although for slightly different motivations. but they would embark on this wonderful affair, meeting with Fidel Castro and leaders in the Cuban government to provide a private ferry to transport Cuban refugees to Miami. So what happened was, in 1962, when Kennedy implemented the travel embargo against Cuba, there were approximately 250,000 Cubans with U.S. entry visas, but no effective way to travel to Cuba because private transportation was blocked through the embargo.
Mm-hmm.
So Derber, through his connections with Cuban intelligence, signed an exclusive agreement to provide the only private transportation out of Cuba. And he did this in direct coordination with Fidel. And the State Department said, well, you can't do that because of the embargo. And his response was, well, I'm not an American subject. I'm a British national. And so therefore the embargo doesn't apply to me. And when he attempted with Sari to establish this private ferry to transport Cuban refugees to the US, that's when the full weight of the CIA and State Department came crashing down on him.
Okay, I see. This was going to be with his cruise ship, or was he trying to buy like another boat again for this particular project?
So initially he wanted to do it with his cruise ship. So what started this all off is after the Bay of Pigs invasion, there were approximately 1,100 members of the brigade that were held prisoner in Cuba at the Isle of Pines. And the Kennedy administration arranged for a private negotiator named James Donovan, who's famous for
Oh yeah.
the Bridge of Spies. So he actually had a fascinating career after the Bridge of Spies, where he helped negotiate the release of these 1,100 prisoners from the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the only challenge was that the Kennedy administration needed a private ship to transport back the prisoners because they wanted to have deniable distance from the Kennedy government. And so Derber volunteered his boat to transport back the Bay of Pigs prisoners, which was accepted by the Red Cross. And then at the last minute, the deal was reneged. And Derber said, okay, fine, I'm going to go ahead anyway. And that's when he went on to sign this agreement to provide the only private transportation out of Cuba. And so then none of his existing ships could be used because the flag nations, that is the nation that in which the boats were registered, refused to have their boats be used for operations related to Cuba because of the embargo.
Mm-hmm.
So he had to find a suitable ship. So eventually he found an opening in Jamaica because Jamaica was independent of the British Crown at this stage and did not have its own navy. So he, with the help of the Cuban government, he was able to secure a ship in Jamaica and do his first test run from Cuba to the US with 23 refugees. And he was successful in transporting them to the US. And then at that point, he was arrested for this smuggling operation. The trial ended in a mistrial, but he was then deported as a national security risk.
Oh my gosh! Wow. So he avoided significant jail time, but also was that it for him? I mean, did he not reside in the U.S. anymore for the rest of his life after that?
Yeah, yeah. So the trial was in '63. He was deported in '64. He returned to England briefly, and then actually made his way to Canada, where he trafficked in either forged or fraudulent bonds, and also engaged in various forms of financial fraud. And from there, he was deported from Canada.
Mm.
So at this stage, he had been barred from the US, Canada, Jamaica, Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, pretty much all the
Oh my
crown
gosh!
colonies. So he was persona non grata pretty much everywhere except England. So he made his way to Nicaragua and Honduras. And then Mexico for a period. I spent jail time in Honduras for fraud, jail time in Mexico for fraud, and then established his operations in Colombia. And at that time in Colombia, he was surviving through financial fraud, boat hijackings, and also established a lobster farming fleet. So, and whether or not that was a cover or a legitimate operation remains to be seen. A lot of the boats were far in excess of what you need to capture lobsters. But Colombia was his base of operations from the late 60s until the early 70s.
Wow, wow. So I mean, all of this. It sounds like his life is really spiraling in some ways because if you're talking about especially like boat hijackings, like getting into actual violent, illegal confrontations rather than just smuggling and staying under the radar, so to speak. Was that what was happening, or was he just becoming like a very different type of man by that point?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, you have to imagine the fall from grace of he was featured repeatedly on the front cover of the Miami Herald as, a bold exile runner. He had his gorgeous lover on his
Hmm.
arm, engaging in this moral crusade to save Cuban refugees. And then a few years later, he's, sitting in a Colombian prison
Hmm.
convicted of boat hijacking. So I have to imagine it was a pretty terrible existence. And the photos from that time just show him just a different man. I think he, went from wearing, tailored three-piece suits and looking, every bit the debonair British sailor
Yeah, very
to
suave. Yeah.
basically scrapping by through, fraud and hijacking
Hmm.
jail service in Colombia.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you've got one ID photo of him in here, and he's got the longer hair, and he's
Yeah.
scraggly. I mean, he kind of looks like the guy that would be living this lifestyle by that point.
Yeah.
And some of the others, yeah, I mean, right off of the cover of Life magazine or something. So it's a major physical change as well as all the exterior changes that occurred. So, and did his relationship ultimately fell apart with Sari as well, right? Like they never married in the end. I don't think.
Yeah, so it was interesting because when he was establishing the boat ferry from Cuba to the US, when he landed in the Bahamas, US INS officers intercepted him in the Bahamas and they said, if you go to Cuba, you will have to relinquish your US visa. So he was faced with this incredibly difficult decision of giving up his right to return to the US and start a life with Sari, or accepting the invitation to go to Cuba, meet with Fidel, and continue the refugee operation. So he chose to relinquish his US visa and continue
Oh
with the
wow.
Cuban operation. And then ultimately, when he was deported, that was the end of his relationship with Sari. And, she went on to have a very fulfilling life. She regained custody of her 3 children and married a man that Derber had introduced her to as a way to set her up in her new life. But at that stage, their romance was unfortunately severed.
Mm. Wow. Okay. Well, good for her that she kind of got out of that whole lifestyle. I guess that was probably for the best for her,
Mm.
especially considering what happened to Harold in the end.
Yeah. Mm.
Dang. So all this time we've been talking about, he's had so many different schemes, but what was it that led him? I guess it was around 1970 to actually get into trafficking drugs as well.
Yeah, so in 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which was an effort to rationalize all the disparate drug laws into one rational framework, and that's what led to the modern schedule classification of
Mm,
drugs.
okay.
And as part of that, they made a glaring oversight, which is that they inadvertently nullified an aspect of the 1941 Narcotics Import Act so that it was now legal for US ships to have drugs in international waters. So this was what was called the mothership loophole. And Derber recognized that this was an enormous opportunity for any trafficker because overnight it became completely legal to have drugs even by the ton load in international waters. So his innovation was the invention of the drug mothership, where he would take a cargo freighter or one of those oversized lobster boats I mentioned
Hmm.
earlier, park it in the middle of the Atlantic, and then have speedboats race out to meet him at the mothership, do the drug transfer mid-ocean, and then race it back to shore. And in order to charge the mothership operators, enforcement needed to actually witness the drug transfer happening mid-ocean. So it was not sufficient just to have drugs on a ship. They needed to actually witness the drugs being transported. But the speedboats at the time, these were Magnum and cigarette powerboats, were capable of 80, 90 miles an hour, so they could easily outrun the Coast Guard
Mm,
cutters. And this became the dominant mode for bringing drugs to America in the 1970s.
wow.
So we see an approximate tripling of marijuana imports into America during this time from the early 1970s to the late 1970s. And we tend to think of that in terms of the increase in demand as the 1960s counterculture sort of permeated into mainstream society. But on the supply side, this was all made possible by the mothership innovation. This was vastly more volume than you could transport by plane or by car. And it was through this fleet of cargo ships that Derber became the chief supplier of marijuana to America
Oh my
in the
gosh.
1970s. So I estimate he was bringing in somewhere between 700 and 2,000 tons of marijuana. Interesting slip there, per year, and all
2000.
completely legal. And
Oh
that's
my
really the
gosh.
most astounding aspect of this. And it would not that loophole, the mothership loophole, would not get closed until 1980 when they passed the Marijuana in the High Seas Act. It required a specific law in order to close that loophole. But in the meantime, Gerber was very happy to exploit it to become the chief supplier of marijuana to America.
My gosh. So you said up to 2,000 tons a year. So that's around 5 tons a day on average. And he was
Yeah,
he was the source of that primarily.
yeah, that's right.
Incredible.
There were a number of other smugglers, some using motherships as well, but he had a fleet of approximately a dozen cargo freighters,
Oh man.
each with capacities between 30 and 50 tons. They were doing, on average, a run of one per month. So if you multiply the number of ships by the number
Hmm.
of months by the capacity, you can arrive at
My gosh.
these really astounding sums. And he was also able to use a lot of the craft he acquired both in the merchant navy and also in the latter part of his smuggling career. So they used sideband receivers and voice scramblers. They had channel scanners. So they were using, the most sophisticated counter surveillance techniques available at the time to outsmart not only the DEA, but also the Coast Guard, Florida Marine Patrol, State Bureau of Investigation, and so on. But what's remarkable is that no one could actually witness a drug transfer being done mid-ocean, which was what they would need to actually prosecute him.
Incredible. So since you mentioned that, does that mean then potentially that like Coast Guard and DEA were fully aware of who he was and which ships were his and that sort of thing? They simply would have to be on station to actually watch the speedboats, link up in the ocean. Is that correct? Or were they not
Yeah,
even sure how many ships he had, for example?
yeah. So there was one ship in particular, which was really the flagship, which was called the Night Train,
Well, that's
and
a good name.
this
Hmm.
became the bête noire of the Coast Guard, the DEA, various state marine patrols. And actually, the later intercept of the night train in 1977 with 54 tons of marijuana was the largest drug seizure in American history
Good
at the
God.
time. And I think it's for marijuana, I think it still ranks in the top five ever in
Wow.
US history.
Wow.
And so the night train became the focus of much of the drug interdiction efforts. And what's really remarkable is that it led to a proposal by a Marine Patrol officer to use military satellites to track Derber ships in order to witness a mid-ocean transfer. And what's remarkable about that is the military is typically off limits for drug interdiction because it violates the Posse Comitatus Act,
Hmm.
which prohibits the use of military resources for law enforcement. So this program called Operation Stopgap went to Henry Kissinger's desk, who authorized the use of military resources, not only naval satellites, but also naval reconnaissance planes to try to track down Derber's ship, the night train. And that was the very first approval of military for drug interdiction. So if we think about the firing shot in the militarized war on drugs, it very much starts with this top secret operation called
Mm.
Operation Stopgap. And what's really remarkable is when I put in a Freedom of Information request to the DEA for any records about Operation Stopgap, they said, sorry, all the records have been destroyed.
Sorry about that. Too late, David. Wow.
Yeah, but it shows the lengths they had to go to in order to intercept his ships.
Mm. Incredible. Well, it certainly sounds that for a while there, at least, he had found that level of success that he had always been chasing. So how wealthy did he get off of all of this if he was the main guy, the chief of all this?
Yeah, so the DEA said that hundreds of millions of dollars were flowing through his accounts. I don't know what his fixed balance was at any
Hmm.
time, but it was potentially in hundreds of millions. And he also had very substantial assets, both through his fleet and also, as we'll get to in a moment, he was very heavily involved in stock fraud. So he also had very large stock holdings as well. So, I would put the estimate, roughly in the area of a few $100 million in 1970s dollars, which is
Good
maybe a
God.
few billion today. What's interesting is when he passed, or after he was assassinated, my relatives, his so-called wife at the time, and this is not featured in the book, this happened after his assassination. My relatives sued his wife to get access to the estate, and they were eventually successful. But once they went to access all of his accounts, they were completely emptied. So even the safety deposit boxes were completely emptied. Most of
Oh,
his
gosh.
savings was in banks in Panama, which were completely emptied.
Mm. Okay, so this was like 1980 or something like that happened? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying? Okay.
that's right.
Okay. Okay. Oh my gosh. So I understand also that he was involved in some sort of like guns for drugs trade with the Cubans. How did that occur exactly?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because there's been a lot of speculation about Cuba's seminal role in the drug trade in the 1970s. And there's one trafficker in particular named Jamie Giolora with Johnny Crump that has attracted a lot of attention. And this is one more piece of evidence that Cuba was very heavily involved in fomenting the American drug trade. So his ships would load in Barranquilla in Colombia and then take the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. And there's a very narrow thread, about 10 miles wide, in between those two areas that remains in international waters. And so he faced a problem where the ships would stray into Cuban waters where they would be seized. And there was a big sit down in Colombia where the Cuban government negotiated with the Colombian drug traffickers to allow safe passage of the drug ships in exchange for only two requests. So the ships would have to pay a $800,000 docking fee, and then on the return trip, they would have to deliver guns to the Marxist guerrillas in Latin America.
Hmm.
And so Derber would bring his drug ships up the Atlantic seaboard and deliver the drugs from, all the way from Florida up to Canada. And then on the return trip, they would load the guns and bring them to Colombian guerrillas, actually. And so he was one of the early participants in the Cuban guns for drugs trade.
Hmm. Wow, that's incredibly useful for them because they're fulfilling their like foreign policy goals essentially of destabilization and making $800,000 every time a ship comes to port. That sounds like a really good deal for the Cubans.
Yeah, I think they had a number of objectives. One was obviously to finance the overall administration, also to export the revolution to Latin America, and then ideologically, if they could, poison the minds of the bourgeoisie with drugs, that was an added benefit as well.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Win 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 there for Cuba. My gosh. So you've mentioned several times now that Harold was assassinated. Can you just walk me through that, like what happened and when exactly?
Yeah, so he was laundering his drug proceeds through a brokerage called First Jersey Securities, which at the time would eventually grow to become the largest securities fraud in American history. I think it was $300 million in 1970s dollars, which is a few billion today. And he was able to multiply his drug fortune, multiple fold through this fraudulent brokerage. And as part of that, he was also laundering money for the Gambino crime family. And
Harold is not short of ambition at all, is he?
no,
My gosh.
it's true. And so the night before he was scheduled to testify to the SEC in their investigation into First Jersey Securities fraudulent activities, he was assassinated by two professional hitmen outside of his condominium on Millionaires Row in Miami. Interestingly, these same two hitmen had assassinated his lookalike, or someone that might have been a case of mistaken identity, 5 months previously
Hmm.
in North Carolina. So the fact that they had killed someone resembling him in a case of mistaken identity in North Carolina and now were able to hunt him down in Miami suggests that these were very serious people.
Yeah.
So his killers were never caught. and there are various theories. So the Colombians had a $1 million contract on him, so it could very easily have been the Colombians. It could also have been members of the Gambino crime family to prevent his testimony into the money laundering operation. And then, there are more, speculative theories that it could have been other US based drug operators. I think that's less clear. So I haven't put down a firm bet yet. I'm leaning slightly towards the Colombians, but at this stage, it's still very much an unsolved murder.
Mm-hmm.
I had the good fortune to work with the Miami cold case unit, who had a extensive box of files on the murder, but
Very
to this day it still remains open. I do have a sketch of one of the suspects if anyone
Oh, cool.
wants to help us out. But one of my aims is also through this book to help see if I can uncover who assassinated my cousin.
Wow. Yeah, there's no shortage of suspects there,
Yeah.
honestly. So he certainly made a lot of enemies. That's incredible, and not a I guess a surprising end for him. Perhaps in the moment that it occurred, it was surprising for him. But I mean,
Yeah,
it feels like he was heading toward that.
Yeah, I'll add one detail, which is I was going through the autopsy report, and you think, how interesting could an autopsy report be? But there was one line where they recovered the bullet from his brain, and it was engraved with his initials.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So I think these were pretty serious people.
Wow. Yeah, they certainly were. My gosh. So one thing that's been, permeating his whole story is involvement with intelligence agencies, Cuban intelligence, Sari with the CIA, obviously. Did you find any direct evidence that he was working with or, targeted by intelligence agencies of any country while you're doing all this research?
So in terms of his affiliations, one of his closest allies was a very senior figure in the Cuban government named Captain Victor Pina.
Mm-hmm.
So he was part of the old guard. He fought with Castro in the revolution. He founded the Revolutionary Air Force. He's the one that secured MiGs for the Cuban Air Force. And he also, with Che Guevara, founded the Cuban Intelligence Service, DGI. So he was one of Derber's closest confidants and collaborators, and helped Derber establish the ferry service from Cuba to the US. I don't know how Derber first came into contact with Captain Pina and how he was potentially brought into alliance with Cuban intelligence. And I have some speculative thoughts there, but I haven't been able to really pin down what his first introduction was to Cuban intelligence. But that was his main ally within the Cuban government. I think what's very suspicious is if you consider the fact that he was able to re-enter the US in 1973 on a visa issued by the State Department after he had been banned from the US as a national security risk. He actually had been deported from the US twice. He was banned from about a dozen countries, served jail time in half a dozen countries, and then was readmitted to the US.
Mm-hmm.
The DEA at the time and both now has been incredibly obstructive. So they stonewalled his murder investigation. They stonewalled the murder investigation into his lookalike. They've destroyed all of their records on Harold. It's quite interesting because when I submitted the Freedom of Information request to the DEA, their initial reply was they couldn't release his file under the exemption for methods and sources. And I then appealed their decision saying it was 50 years ago and the subject is deceased. And they replied by saying, again, oh, sorry, we destroyed all his records.
After that first reply, we immediately
it seems to be a common theme with the DA. So the working theory, both from Miami homicide and his drug accomplices, is that he was an informant for the DEA, informing potentially on the drug operation, but also any gun trafficking activities as well.
Okay, yeah, I mean, clearly he knew a lot about so many things in an entire region, an entire hemisphere, really, so a tremendously valuable contact. But he's also the guy who's making all of this happen. Like, he absolutely deserved to be in prison for all of the things that he was doing. So, why leave him on the outside, unless he's of great use to you. And one thing, perhaps I'm overthinking this, David, but as I notice, he's constantly running afoul of the law in so many different countries, and yet the punishment is never quite a life-ending kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, he didn't spend 20 years in prison for any of these charges in any of these countries. Deported, but then allowed to return, et cetera, et cetera. It just seemed like he was, had the greatest luck ever for a career criminal, or maybe he was, somebody was watching out for him, or more than someone.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of aspects to that. I think one is he was brilliant at finding loopholes. So, for example, smuggling Cuban refugees in a way that was completely legal because he wasn't a US national, or having a floating casino beyond the 3 mile limit, or innovating the mothership concept. He was able to skirt incredibly close to the law in a way that somehow saved his skin. And he was also just a very smooth character and able to talk himself out of many situations. But you're absolutely right. I mean, he served, I think, 7 months in prison in Mexico and a few months in Colombia. But given the scale of his crimes, it's amazing that he didn't serve more significant jail time or face more severe consequences. Part of that is because I think he was allied with so many different interests at the same time. There was this nexus of agencies that he was working with at any given time. And yeah, but ultimately it came to a head when, unfortunately, he met his demise during his assassination. I'll mention one other interesting fact, which is I haven't seen it firsthand, but there's a reporter for the Atlanta Constitution who reported at the time that he's seen the intelligence document that claims, and I want to emphasize it's just a claim at this stage, that Derber was the KGB station chief for Miami.
Hmm.
So that,
Unexpected.
yeah, so it's unexpected, but and I haven't been able to substantiate that any further. But it's one more thread that we'll have to chase down.
Yeah, certainly. There's always more to this story. That's fantastic, and I'm also glad to hear that. Although, in a literal sense, you've closed the book on him, you haven't closed the book on him in the sense that you're going to keep looking. So that's fascinating, and I would love to know if there's any further developments even after all this time.
Yeah, so I have a number of Freedom of Information requests pending. His National Security Agency file is still classified. I'm about to submit a lawsuit to get that
Oh wow.
declassified. And I have still Freedom of Information requests pending from the CIA and some other agencies as well. So as those come to surface, I'd love to share those with my readers, my
Yeah, by all
community,
means.
so we can help to dig into the story even further.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that because there's always more to these stories, and it sounds like that something might come to light pretty soon. In this case, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sounds like you're continuing to look at this story even with the publication of the book. Do you have any other big projects you're working on, like another book, in the works after this, perhaps?
Yeah, so I've absolutely found my passion writing about crime and espionage. I'm a former entrepreneur. I sold my business, and I feel very fortunate to have discovered this second calling as a writer. So I'm looking forward to the book tour for The Wireless Operator, and then I have another book which I'll submit to publishers in the early part of next year, which is a overlooked, fascinating story in World War II espionage that hasn't been extensively covered before. And then I have another project that I've just started, which is an investigation into the CIA's campaign to suppress the diagnosis of PTSD during the Vietnam War. So
Oh
they
wow.
launched a concerted campaign to discredit PTSD as a psychiatric diagnosis for both ideologic and economic reasons. And I think that's a story that hasn't been widely told yet.
Yeah.
So I'll look forward to bringing that to light as well.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's the first I'm hearing of that right now from you. So that certainly cannot be that widely known. That's amazing. So you mentioned a book tour. Do you already have like the dates and locations worked out for that? Is that something that people can look at if they want to, meet you in person and get a signed copy, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I love meeting with my readers. So I want to invite you to come to any one of our events. I'll be in the UK kicking off the tour in September through to October. And then the US tour will start in October. So, please come along. I'd love to meet you and chat more. Absolutely.
Great, great, great. And you have like a website where they can follow up on this and see the tour specifics and that sort of thing as well. Can you share that?
Yeah, so actually, we have a lot of video material from the time, as well as some of the government documents and photos. So I can invite your listeners to visit our webpage at davidtuch.com, and we have the event schedule there as well. And please subscribe to our newsletter if you want to be updated on what we find out from the CIA.
Okay, fantastic. I've been to your site, and I have to tell you, it's one of the most polished and professional that I've seen from any author in a long time. So it really draws you into the story, even for the casual browser. Honestly, it pulls you right in.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm glad you enjoyed it. That's cool.
Well, fantastic, David. I really appreciate your time. For those of you who want to pick up the book, it should be available on Amazon as you're listening to this episode. The title is "The Wireless Operator: The Untold Story of the British Sailor Who Invented the Modern Drug Trade" by David Tuch. David, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to what comes next.
Thanks so much, Justin. That was a lot of fun.
Of course. Take care.
Take care now.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.